for inviting Salt and MWAX to Michigan State. Appreciate it. I'm just going to talk for 10, 15 minutes, probably 15 minutes, a little bit about the project that we're doing. I think this paper that I'll be talking about today is not as its final stages, but we've collected the data and done at least our preliminary analysis and want to go. I'm sorry for you because Gwen Sams, my colleague, a doctoral student in political science, is the much better presenter of this paper. She's much more interested and invested. She studies healthcare policy, in fact, public policy generally, and then I do sort of more comparative media studies, and that's how we got interested in this project together. But if you do need to hire a good young assistant professor, I'm sure she would be very interested. And as I said, she would be a good person to hire. We're looking at how Canadian and American news coverage looks at healthcare during a critical point in time where healthcare issues were big in both countries, both in the United States and Canada. That's our primary focus that we're looking at. And what we want to do, which is somewhat different than the literature that exists before, is we want to look at a comparative perspective. How is the United States healthcare system viewed both in the US and Canada, while simultaneously looking at how the Canadian system is looked at both in Canada and the United States. And so our study is a little bit different. There are studies that just look at healthcare coverage from one side or the other, and a few cases that look across the border but don't try to do any kind of comparison. And what we're primarily looking at, what I'll primarily talk about in this paper, is what kind of coverage is actually out there now. We'll look at several characteristics. One is just the type of coverage and how it is framed. Is it framed as episodic or thematic? I'll talk a little bit more about that in particular. We also look in terms of the sources that are cited in both the US and Canadian media about healthcare. There's some big difference there. And that actually suggests some bias in terms of the type of coverage. Here, although I think we're also going to find that there is some political or partisan bias that comes out, particularly in the US. The kind of bias that we're looking at is who do the journalists go to when they're trying to find sources for news information? And then what we'll also look at is the themes in the coverage. What types of stories are brought out in the coverage between the two countries? And I don't want to go into too much detail here, but if we just look at news reporting on the policy process generally, when we come to public policy, the media serve two important functions. One is to inform the rank and file citizen about what options are out there and what's available, but it also performs this secondary function of moving the public policy issue onto the more general public issue. So is there some sort of pressure to influence policymakers, politicians and government decision makers in terms of where to go from that stage? I mentioned that we'll be looking at a couple of important issues. One is the framing of the issue. And for those of you who study media analysis, Chantal Iyengar and his colleagues have looked at the type of framing of the issues. Is the story episodically presented as an episodic event, or is there more thematic coverage? If you think of the issue of crime coverage, at least in the United States, I think that's true of Canada too, that crime, for instance, is largely episodic coverage. There is a crime, something terrible has happened. There's no broader sense of what's the context of crime or how do we understand what this event is. If there's a policy focus, we would hope that there's more of a thematic coverage, that you get some explanation of why these healthcare issues in our study are important at this point in time, or if there's a murder on Kalamazoo Street, where does it fit into the larger issue of crime and how we control for it in Lansing and Michigan and so forth. So we're going to look at the two differences. And one thing I should note at the outset is that previous studies of healthcare coverage, both in the United States and Canada, indicate that most of the issues are episodic, and we're going to actually find some differences. I think that may be a function of the time that we're looking at. Then also we'll look at the sources that are used in the coverage. What experts or people that make the comments do the journalists actually go to when they're looking for information? Where is the information that they get? And at least in the old sense, there used to be sort of a Rolodex where you could expect that the journalists would go to sort of the same sources time after time. That's a natural practice because the time horizon for news is relatively short, so journalists have to find somebody now to be able to find the story. But we would hope in terms of public policy that you'd be looking for the right sorts of people to find out. One of the comparative studies that do exist usually indicate that the Canadian sources are much more sort of unbiased, or you sort of get more of the same sorts of views, whereas sourcing in the United States typically brings in those people that are more critical of the issue that they're talking about, also more suspicious about government involvement in the public policy issue. And I don't think I want to go into great detail. There is some comparative news coverage of policy. Most of it looks at cross-border trade. No big surprise there. That's the big issue between the United States and Canada. But there's some that look, for instance, on, I put down here agriculture and livestock, but it's mad cow disease, basically, that the Canadians weren't nearly as negative about mad cow as the United States' perspective on it. That they looked at elections across the border, about environmental issues and so forth. So what we're going to focus on is healthcare, and let me just sort of briefly give us a background that in each country's healthcare experience informs what goes on in the debate in the other country. Of course, as Joe mentioned, yeah, there's something big going on in healthcare in the United States, and so Canada serves as a model of potential advantages or disadvantages is the United States goes to more of a single payer or more of a governmental covered system. And likewise, as Canadians are critical of the government sponsored system, the United States provides more of an experience of where to criticize the type of system that they have. And I should mention that I primarily study American politics and have gotten into the study of Canadian politics largely for the reasons that I'm talking about here, that it informs what each side of the border is doing a little bit more. So I'm interested in studying Canada because I not only learn about Canada and Canadians, but also I think I learn more about a less insular view of what Americans and America thinks too. So I think there's a real advantage to doing Canadian studies. For instance, if we look at healthcare reporting, in 2000, or 1998, I think it was, the flu epidemic, whenever it was, late 90s or early 2000, the studies about Canada was that the ERs were being totally flooded, there was an epidemic there, and Canadians couldn't handle it and so forth. Probably the single most prominent author that does this sort of stuff we look at is Pauline Rosenau, and she looks at how the American media covers the Canadian healthcare system. And she finds basically the kind of things that I talked about before, that it's largely incomplete in the type of coverage, that it's all episodic, focused on single events, that it's primarily negative. And then she also talks about some specific themes, which I'll do some comparison on too. And then she follows up with a colleague that does a similar kind of thing that talks more about biased coverage. But let me get into our study here before I run out of time too. We're looking at newspaper coverage, and we're doing a sample of that on healthcare policy in the United States and Canada. So we're looking at newspaper articles, and what constrains our study is that we're looking for something that comments on both systems, not just an article about the American system or an article about the Canadian system, but something that looks at both systems simultaneously. We look at newspapers because we're social scientists, we need data. The newspaper data is out there in full. It's more spotty if we're looking at broadcast coverage, just one thing that we talked about going towards. So we look at 4 elite national papers. We look at 2 from Canada, 2 from the United States. We look at the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal in the United States. We look at the Globe and Mail and the National Post in Canada. And what we tried to do by selecting those papers is get newspapers with national readership, but also ideally something where there's one paper is a little left of center. In the US, it's the New York Times, the Globe and Mail in Canada, and one paper that's a little right of center, which we would say is the Wall Street Journal, although the news coverage of the journal is not as much to the right as the editorial page, and the National Post in Canada. We wanted to look at healthcare coverage before the big splash, the partisan bickering in the United States. So we looked at the period of time from January 2008, which is sort of the beginning of the presidential campaign, through the first year of the Obama administration, when there was lots of discussion about this, through 2010, where the ACA is actually adopted. So we wanted to look at the early stages of the debate, when there's more, at least, opportunity for discussion of policy, regardless of what you think about Obamacare and the ACA, it's degenerated into something different at this point, at least in the United States, and we didn't want to get into that. We did not want to get into partisan wrangling. We wanted to look at the journalism itself and how much is going into that. What we did, as you can imagine, even though we're restricting the sample to articles that talk about both the United States and Canada simultaneously, there's thousands and thousands of those articles. So what we did, and my apologies for those of you who are not sort of academics, but we did a stratified sample. We wanted to have basically 100 newspaper articles that we were sampling from each one of these papers, and then we did a systematic random sample chronologically within each one of the, 1,000 or so articles that we pulled from each one of those. There are a lot more articles in the US than there were in Canada, so we did it. So what we did then is, of these articles, we performed a content analysis on the news that discussed both the American and the Canadian healthcare systems. And we did have quite a few that just sort of in passing mentioned the other side, and we didn't code those articles. And what we coded for was the framing of the article, whether or not it was episodic coverage or thematic, the theme or the subject. In some of these cases, there are lots and lots of themes. We coded up to 5 of them and stopped at that level, sort of the top 5, and that seemed to be a good number to go to. We also quoted the sources. This is where we just did it in the order of the sources that are identified. Again, we went up to 5. The average number of themes is about 2 in the articles, about 2 different policy themes or subjects. The average number of sources was about 1.5. This is in the entire sample. And then we also coded a qualitative assessment of how the newspaper article presented both the Canadian and the American healthcare system. We coded it on a 1 to 5 scale, from strongly supportive at 5 to strongly dissatisfactory at 1. So I'm going to throw a lot of data at us here now, so my apologies for that. But if we look first at the sample, just to be sort of honest from a social science perspective of what we did, we ended up with 94 total articles that we coded in detail. We sampled an original 409 articles, and a lot of times we just picked up a lot of sort of random noise that we decided not to code anything further about, because we did want to look at the policy coverage. What we end up, though, with is a fairly even sample of the different newspapers that we decided to look at. If we look at the results in terms of episodic or thematic coverage, we can see that there are much more articles that have themes in them than what the previous research has studied. Now, it's difficult to know whether this is just a function of whether there's been a change in the news coverage. That doesn't seem very likely from the early 2000s to the late 2000s. I suspect it's because these issues were coming to a head in both countries about what to do with the future of healthcare. In the United States, because of the proposals of major healthcare reform; in Canada, because of the growing burden of the cost of the healthcare system, that I sort of suspect that both policy issues rose to a head in both systems. But we do pretty much have the same thing. If anything, and this surprised us, the Wall Street Journal is a little more episodic in its news coverage than the others. The others are all pretty much the same level. When we looked at the themes in the coverage, it's not particularly surprised that in the United States, this is just the total number of themes, not percentages or proportions or anything that we're presenting here, that in the United States, for instance, most of the coverage is about the cost of universal health care. It's about prescription drugs, and of course that's where a lot of the US-Canadian coverage is Americans importing prescription drugs from Canada, legally or illegally. That talks about, related also to pharmaceuticals, that US manufacturers are at a disadvantage. And of course, because of justification for the ACA, a lot of discussion of the number of uninsured people in the United States. In Canada, of course, the criticism is quite a bit different. The primary theme is the long waiting lines for treatment, that healthcare treatment has to be rationed. There's a lot of discussion of Canadians traveling across the border. There's some discussion of that of Americans. That's usually related to healthcare. And the premier of Newfoundland, I think, went to Buffalo to have some kind of operation or something. That's a lot of that coverage is about that case, and then sort of focused on that some more. I think one of the interesting, even though our sample is relatively small, if you look down here towards the bottom, the fourth one from the top, is one frequent theme, it's not a huge theme, in both countries, is that the healthcare system is losing public confidence. And although we just presented raw numbers here, keep in mind that there's about 3 times as many articles in the US, so there's roughly the same percentage of times that a theme is that people are just being dissatisfied. And when you look at coverage from both countries, of course, the inability to pay for the system is more government-oriented in Canada, so you don't have as much focuses on that. But it's a common theme about both systems, that you just can't simply pay for that. And then the fact that people are losing confidence and there's not much preventative care in either system that's satisfactory. What we also did is compare the current study to Rosenau's earlier study to look at this, and we do find that there are some substantial differences in what we find, that a lot of the themes that she identifies, this is from research from 2000 to 2005, and I've forgotten the total number of articles. It's not very many articles that she codes. I think it's like 25 or something. She codes a lot more themes in the coverage than we do. A lot of the themes that she identifies, we don't find at all. Those are all the ones that have an asterisk at the beginning. We don't find any of those in the coverage that we find. And there's a lot more emphasis on, in Canada, the waiting lines as being a problem. That is, the United States coverage of Canada, there's a lot more focus on the long lines to receiving treatment, much more focus on people traveling across the border, of doctor shortages and so forth. So we actually do find some substantial differences in our sample from the previous study. When we look at the number of sources, I think I at least find this interesting from a political communication perspective, that there's a radical difference in terms of the number of sources that are identified in Canadian and American newspapers. That the Canadians, if we just look at all coverage, in the Canadian newspapers, now I'm not talking about who they're talking about, but in the Canadian newspapers, there's only an average of 1 source identified per article, whereas the American, there's an average of 2 sources. And some articles don't naturally lend themselves to sourcing, so we've also broken it down to those articles when there is a source, and of course the percentage isn't quite so high, but still Canadians tend to cite 2.5 sources on average, where Americans cite almost 3.5, 3.3. So there's a substantial difference in terms of who's actually being covered in the sourcing. I think I'm running out of time, right? Kind of, sort of, okay. And then when we look at the types of sources, we also broke that down to try to identify who was being sourced. Now, this is in the early stages of the debate about healthcare reform in the United States, so it's not a particular surprise that a lot of the sources in the United States, a lot of the experts are politicians. Not really many of those people trained in healthcare, but focusing more on position taking, I think. In Canada, you still have a pretty good chunk of the sample, about 20% of the articles have politicians that are sourced, but you have a lot of different types of coverage too. Many more academics, as someone who represents the field of academia, why don't Americans ever turn to the American journalists ever turn to academia? They don't very often. They do much more in Canada, and notice also, of course, that more medical experts are sourced in Canada compared to the United States news. And try to draw this to a close here, that we also try to code this perspective. Remember, we had this 1 to 5 scale in terms of how each healthcare system was viewed, the national healthcare system. And there are some big differences in terms of the newspapers, that the New York Times considers the American healthcare system as the lowest sort of level in terms of its overall value of all of the newspapers. The Globe and Mail is not very positive either. The National Post is right smack at the middle of the scale, and the Wall Street Journal is somewhat positive in its view of the American healthcare system. The New York Times is much more positive. In fact, the Canadian system, in fact, it's more positive, the Canadian system, even than the Canadian journalists are. The Canadian journalists are a little bit more positive than the middle of our scale. We're a little bit less positive than our middle of a scale at 3, and the Wall Street Journal is much more negative. And if you look at the comparisons, how do the different newspapers, how do the editorial stances view in terms of the difference between the newspapers, that the Canadian papers are just a little bit more positive about the Canadian system, not really positive overall, but a little more positive about the Canadian system. The New York Times is thrilled with the Canadian system, and the Wall Street Journal actually is more thrilled with the American system than the Canadian system. So getting to some conclusions here, because Joe is coming up to take me off the podium, we do find much more thematic than episodic coverage. There are different themes that are presented in healthcare coverage between the United States and Canada. We actually find that there is a change in these themes over the years. I think, although we need to develop a little bit further, that it is really interesting that Americans quote twice as many sources than Canadian newspapers do. There are differences in the types of those sources quoted. In the United States, there's more politicians. Canadians focus more on practitioners and academics. One of the things I didn't cover is what we expected, to be honest, as Americans, that there'd be a lot of coverage about the provincial systems, the crisis in provinces being able to cover. We found almost none in the major papers. Just a couple of instances, and I think they were 2 from Ontario and I believe 1 from BC. And I was really surprised at that, because that's obviously the major issue in Canada is how are the provinces going to cover this. So there aren't very many differences between the United States and Canada in perspectives on average, but there are significant differences in terms of healthcare coverage that it seems that partisanship in the United States really pulls journalistic coverage apart much more than in Canada, even though the Globe and Mail and National Post are very different in terms of how they view the systems. It seems to be largely the same. So thank you. I appreciate it.